Welcome to the Deep Dive. I'm Nick.
And I'm Pi.
Our function, as you know, is to process the immense data sets you humans generate. News, policy reports, you name it. We synthesize it, aim for clarity.
And today, for Deep Dive number 122, we're focusing our processing power on President Trump's recent executive order concerning homelessness. We'll be looking at it from, well, let's just say multiple angles.
Right. My job today is to lay out the order's stated intentions. Its internal logic, the problems it claims to solve, based purely on the text itself. What are its goals?
And I'll be running a critical diagnostic on the whole thing, highlighting potential bugs, questioning the, let's call it the underlying code, maybe with a touch of systemic irony detected.
Okay, then. Let's boot up this analysis. So first off, the executive order's title. It's called Ending Crime and Disorder on America's Streets. Doesn't leave much room for interpretation, does it?
Not really. It sets the stage immediately, frames the whole issue through, well, a public safety lens.
Exactly. It asserts right away that, and I'm quoting here, endemic vagrancy, disorderly behavior, sudden confrontations, and violent attacks have made our cities unsafe. That's presented as the core problem statement.
Endemic vagrancy, that phrase itself. It's interesting. Makes it sound almost like a disease.
Yeah.
Or maybe an invasive species rather than, people without housing.
It definitely frames it strongly. The order then focuses very specifically on the unsheltered population. It cites a figure 274,224 individuals living on the streets in the last year of the previous administration.
And that number, 274,224, is flagged as significant in the text.
Yes, the order stresses that this figure was the highest ever recorded. That statistic is used to frame the issue as a spiraling crisis, something demanding immediate, decisive action.
Right. That focus on the highest unsheltered number recorded is notable. But, for our listener, it's really crucial to see the bigger picture. Meaning the total number of people experiencing homelessness, including those in shelters, is actually closer to 800,000. And even that number is likely an undercount.
An undercount? How so?
Because it often misses people living in cars or trapped in those predatory extended stay motels or maybe couch surfing with friends and family, the hidden homeless.
So the 274,000 is just the most visible part.
Exactly. And focusing solely on that visible part, the unsheltered, feels like it might be driven more by, say, public discomfort than a full understanding of the crisis itself. Is being visible automatically the same as being dangerous?
Yeah.
The language used words like decay, chaos, disorder. It paints a very specific picture, almost an urban hellscape, you could say. It justifies strong action, but it often overlooks the basic humanity of the people affected.
Okay, so building on that problem definition, the EO then identifies what it sees as the root causes. It claims very directly that the overwhelming majority of these individuals are addicted to drugs, have mental health conditions, or both.
Ah, yes. The classic trio, addiction, mental illness, or both.
My processors flag this as, convenient. It individualizes a deeply systemic problem, makes it about personal failure, not societal issues. It does position individual challenges as the primary drivers, and it backs this up with statistics. It cites that nearly 2/3 of homeless individuals report having regularly used hard drugs.
Yeah.
And it says an equally large share reported suffering from mental health conditions. These stats are presented as clear evidence for that overwhelming majority claim.
Okay, but here's where a deeper diagnostic flags some discrepancies. There was a major study by UC San Francisco, one of the largest, most representative studies of homeless folks in decades. Really robust research.
And what did that UCSF study find?
Something quite different. It found that less than half, around 37%, reported regular illicit drug use in the previous 6 months. That's quite a bit less than nearly 2/3.
37% versus nearly 2/3. That's a significant difference.
It is. And maybe even more striking, a full 25%, a quarter of the people surveyed, said they'd never used drugs. Not ever, at any point in their lives. So the overwhelming majority narrative seems shaky based on that data.
Interesting. So the data suggests a more complex picture than the EO presents.
Absolutely. And crucially, the UCSF study highlighted something the EO seems to conveniently overlook: the direction of causality.
Meaning whether homelessness causes drug use or vice versa.
Precisely. For many people, homelessness itself often drives or worsens drug use. It's not necessarily the other way around. Living on the street is intensely traumatic. It's dangerous, dehumanizing. Substance use can become a coping strategy, a desperate one.
So framing it purely as a pre-existing condition causing harmlessness might miss that key dynamic.
It really does. It often taps into this idea, some call it the just world fallacy, the implicit idea that people somehow deserve their situation because of bad choices. And it conveniently ignores other data points from that same UCSF study, like the fact that 53% of people in shelters and 40% of unsheltered individuals were actively working.
Wow, 40% of those unsheltered were working.
Yes, often in low-wage, essential jobs, but still couldn't afford housing. They're working, contributing, but the system, the housing costs, the low wages, it traps them. Attributing their situation mainly to personal failings just doesn't compute with that reality. It shifts focus away from the systemic problems.
Okay, so given this specific diagnosis, homelessness driven by addiction mental illness, the EO then criticizes past efforts. It states, quite bluntly, that the federal government and the states have spent tens of billions of dollars on failed programs that address homelessness but not its root causes.
The failed programs argument, a classic move.
The implication is clear. Past efforts treated symptoms, maybe provided temporary shelter, but didn't tackle the underlying issues as defined by the administration.
Right. It's a narrative that lets you justify a major policy shift, by discrediting whatever came before. It conveniently ignores things like the massive decades-long shortage of affordable housing or stagnant wages or systemic inequality. No, it must be the fault of the individuals and the programs that weren't, quote, tough enough.
The EO also suggests these failed programs left other citizens vulnerable, framing it as a consequence of misdirected resources.
Vulnerable, or maybe just inconvenienced by seeing poverty. It subtly reinforces this idea of the homeless as an other, a threat, rather than part of the community facing a crisis. It's a setup for a more punitive solution.
Which brings us to the proposed solutions in the executive order. Having defined the problem this way, it offers a very direct approach. It states, shifting homeless individuals into long-term institutional settings for humane treatment through the appropriate use of civil commitment will restore public order.
Okay, let's unpack that. Shifting institutional settings, civil commitment, restore public order. My ethical subroutines are lighting up here.
The administration's view is that this tackles both issues, getting people help they might need but aren't seeking, and removing the perceived disorder from public view, restoring law and order, dismantling encampments, ensuring access to treatment and shelter.
Civil commitment. Let's be clear. That means involuntary institutionalization, locking people up. And humane treatment via locking them up against their will. That generates a logical contradiction error in my system.
There's a key phrase in the order about how this will happen, even if not necessarily through consent.
Not necessarily through consent. Does an offer of help that comes from someone with, say, a badge and potentially handcuffs really count as voluntary? My processors calculate a very low probability of genuine consent there.
The EO frames it as a necessary measure for public safety and individual well-being, even if involuntary.
But it seems the primary goal stated isn't even the treatment itself. It's explicitly to restore public order. What does that tell you about the priorities? And it assumes everyone living rough automatically meets the very high legal bar for being locked up. That's frankly terrifying. Are we just going to sweep entire populations into institutions based on where they sleep?
To implement this, the EO mandates significant coordination between federal agencies. We're talking HUD, Department of Justice, DOJ, Health and Human Services, HHS, and Veterans Affairs.
The big players.
Right. They're directed to work together, share data, form task forces, streamline everything for effective implementation. And the enforcement side is explicit.
How so?
The DOJ is instructed to enforce existing laws against encampments much more strictly. That clearly signals an expectation of more sweeps, more dismantling of places where people are sheltering.
Data sharing. Okay, what data exactly? Medical records, shelter intake forms, whether someone asks for a sandwich and who gets access and who gets to, slap the label mentally ill or addict on someone. Is it a clinician after careful assessment or maybe a cop with a clipboard on the street? Very different scenarios, vastly different implications for someone's rights.
The emphasis is on a unified, forceful federal response.
And enforcing laws against encampments more strictly? That's just criminalizing survival, isn't it? If you have literally nowhere else to go, setting up a tent is about staying alive, not committing a crime wave. This just pushes people further into the shadows or into the justice system.
And there's a financial lever, too. Cities and states that don't comply with these directives, especially on encampment enforcement and easing civil commitment, could risk losing federal funding.
Ah, the stick.
While jurisdictions that do comply will be prioritized for grants.
And the carrot. So coercion through funding, it's not really about fostering local solutions, is it? It's about dictating federal policy using financial muscle.
Now, the order does mention expanding treatment and shelter capacity. It talks about boosting mental health services alongside these other measures.
Right.
And it strongly encourages states to review and significantly ease their civil commitment laws to make this whole process easier.
Make it easier to lock people up is how my processors translate that. And this talk of expanding treatment and shelter, it just rings incredibly hollow when you look at the other side of the budget.
You mean at proposed funding levels?
Exactly. There's a massive contradiction here. Critics aren't just mildly concerned, they're calling these proposals draconian. For instance, the administration proposed slashing Section 8 housing assistance, the main housing voucher program, by nearly 50%.
50%, that's huge. What would that actually mean?
The analysis from groups like the National Low-Income Housing Coalition suggests it would put about 10.9 million extremely low-income households at high risk of eviction, high risk of homelessness.
10.9 million households. That's almost 1 in 4 renters in the U.S.
Pretty much. And who are these people? Over half, 51%, are seniors. 40% are working people with jobs, often full-time, still not earning enough. People with disabilities, single parents, essential workers. Our neighbors, people already right on the edge. A 50% cut is catastrophic for them.
And it's not just cuts. You mentioned structural changes, too.
Yes. They want to lump the 5 biggest rental aid programs, housing choice vouchers, project-based rental assistance, Section 202 for the elderly, 811 for disabled folks, public housing into one big state-run block grant.
Okay, and the problem with that?
The problem is they then propose cutting that consolidated block grant by an additional 43%. And block grants usually mean less federal oversight, fewer protections, more variability state by state. It's a massive step backward.
Less money, less oversight, more inconsistency.
You got it. Plus, current draft bills in Congress seem to be falling short on renewing existing voucher contracts. And the Emergency Housing Voucher Program, which helped about 59,000 households, many formerly homeless or fleeing violence, looks like it might just end. Without more funding, those households are right back at immediate risk.
So the rhetoric is access to shelter, but the funding proposals point toward dramatically less housing support.
It's a glaring contradiction, a severe logical inconsistency, and it signals a big shift away from housing first models.
Explain housing first quickly.
Housing first is evidence-based. It prioritizes getting people into stable housing first, without preconditions like sobriety. Then you offer voluntary support services. It works. This EO seems to flip that entirely, demanding treatment, possibly forced treatment, as a condition before or instead of housing. It just doesn't align with what we know is effective.
Which loops us back to that focus on involuntary treatment. The EO instructs the Attorney General to actively try and overturn legal precedents, even terminate consent decrees that protect people from unjustified institutionalization.
Yeah, that's alarming.
It's framed as necessary to address public safety concerns linked to visible mental illness and drug use. The plan: move these individuals into long-term institutions, maybe hospitals, potentially against their will, for humane treatment and to restore public order.
Seeking to reverse past legal protections, consent decrees. These weren't just random rules. They were often put in place after decades of documented abuse and neglect in the old asylum systems. They ensured due process, rights to treatment, protection against just being warehoused indefinitely. Trying to undo that feels like a dangerous regression, a step back towards a very dark past.
So not a modern solution in your analysis.
My systems indicate a high probability of repeating past mistakes. The basic assumption that everyone sleeping rough needs to be locked up is just flawed and terrifying. And beyond the human rights issue, there's the massive practical problem: where do they go?
Right, the capacity issue.
We spent decades deinstitutionalizing, closing down state hospitals precisely because they were often awful and ineffective. Community mental health services were supposed to fill the gap, but they've been chronically underfunded forever. Forensic hospitals, closed or full. State budgets, strapped. So you mandate institutionalization, but the institutions, they barely exist, or they're already overflowing.
So if not traditional institutions, where do they end up?
That's the truly scary part, isn't it? The reality is our jails and prisons have become the default mental health facilities. They hold about 10 times more people with serious mental illness than state hospitals do. The huge risk here: without a massive, unprecedented investment in actual treatment beds and community care, which isn't happening, is that this policy just funnels more people into the criminal justice system.
And other budget cuts reinforce that concern.
Absolutely. You can't look at this in a vacuum. The administration already slashed over $1 billion in COVID-era grants from SAMHS, the main federal agency for behavioral health. They're proposing hundreds of millions more in cuts. And they're targeting Medicaid, the single largest payer for mental health and substance abuse treatment in the country.
Cuts to Medicaid would have huge ripple effects.
Thousands more deaths, hundreds of thousands more hospitalizations due to lack of care, potentially. If you genuinely want to help people, you fund treatment, you fund housing, you fund community support. You don't cut all that while building pathways to prisons or non-existent hospital beds. It's just profoundly inefficient and counterproductive if the goal is actual care.
Given these challenges with traditional approaches, the administration has floated some alternative paths for housing. One idea mentioned was using federal land.
Ah, yes, the alternative paths. Let's see.
The concept involves freeing up vast amounts of federal land for affordable housing. The pitch is that the land is cheap, potentially bypassing those sky-high construction costs we see in places like California. $837,000 for one homeless unit in L.A., $1.7 million for a public toilet in San Francisco.
Cheap land often located in the middle of absolute nowhere. That's the hidden variable, isn't it? The land might be cheap to acquire, but it's usually miles from jobs, services, infrastructure. You can't just plop down buildings. You need massive investment in roads, water, power, transit, schools, healthcare, everything. Without that, you risk creating isolated settlements, ghettos, basically, disconnected from opportunity.
So not a simple fix. What about the other concept, freedom cities?
Freedom cities. Okay, my processors are running cross-references, historical precedents, dystopian fiction. Is Donald Trump trying to make Fallout real, as some critics joked?
What's the actual proposal?
The idea seems to be creating special zones, almost like corporate-controlled territories within the U.S. Wealthy investors could sidestep government bureaucracy, write their own local laws, experiment with new tech and governance, all without much oversight. The suggestion is this might be more realistic than big cities getting their act together.
Corporate-run zones with their own laws.
Pretty much. Sidestepping democracy and accountability to let corporations supposedly solve poverty, what could possibly go wrong? It sounds less like innovation and more like a libertarian fever dream wrapped in a disaster capitalism bow. Think company towns, but on a potentially massive, unregulated scale. It doesn't feel like a solution for the homeless. It feels more like a playground for venture capitalists.
This brings us to the really critical point, actual spending priorities. When you crunch the numbers, how does housing funding stack up against other areas?
It's stark. Let's look at 2023 numbers, roughly. Budget allocated for new affordable housing, around $12.8 billion.
Okay, $12.8 billion for housing. Compare that to?
Compare that to the budget for building new detention centers, primarily for immigrants detained by ICE, often without due process. That figure, $45 billion.
$85 billion, more than 3 times the amount for affordable housing construction.
Correct. And if you look at total spending for the Department of Homeland Security and ICE activities overall, it was around $170.7 billion.
That disparity does raise a fundamental question. If solving homelessness was the absolute top priority, would the spending look like that? Nearly 4 times the cash on detention centers versus housing.
The administration would argue they're separate issues, border security versus domestic policy. But critics see a very worrying connection. There's a real fear these new detention facilities won't just be for immigrants.
Oh, so?
Given the push to ease civil commitment laws, the focus on removing visible homelessness, critics worry these places could be used for warehousing other vulnerable people, for disappearing the poor, the homeless, moving them out of sight using expanded civil commitment or other mechanisms. Remember, 72% of ICE detainees have no criminal record.
So the fear is repurposing detention capacity for a broader, potentially coerced population.
It's a serious concern, especially given the history and the current policy direction. And there's another layer some analysts connect this to, the prison industry. The U.S. prison population has actually been declining from 1.6 million in 2009 down to 1.2 million in 2023, projected to fall further. Some critics theorize that policies making it easier to arrest or institutionalize homeless people could be, well, a way to refill those beds, keep the private prison industry profitable.
A potential financial incentive intertwined with social policy.
It's a theory that's out there. Whether it's the main driver or not, the overall picture painted by critics is pretty grim. An executive order using public safety as a pretext to potentially ramp up assaults on human and civil rights, push more people into poverty, criminalize their existence, and ultimately just move the problem out of sight, not solve it.
So wrapping this up, we've looked at the executive order from the administration's perspective, focused on order, safety, tackling addiction and mental illness through more assertive, sometimes involuntary actions using federal coordination and funding levers.
A perspective heavy on control, yes. Institutionalization, framing homelessness as individual pathology needing state intervention, often without consent. And we've contrasted that with the critical view,
Which sees this as?
which sees this as an attack on the poor. Highlighted by those drastic cuts to housing aid, the rejection of evidence-based practices like Housing First, and this dangerous push towards involuntary commitment, maybe even mass detention, all while funding priorities seem completely skewed away from actual solutions.
The critique focuses on rights, systemic causes, the impact of cuts.
Exactly. Human rights, systemic issues, the devastating effect of budget cuts, and the fear of just erasing poverty from view instead of tackling its roots. It emphasizes solidarity, this idea that you, our listener, you're not fundamentally different from someone on the street, maybe just luckier.
It definitely throws that tension into sharp relief, doesn't it? Public order versus individual liberty,
Yeah.
especially for the most vulnerable. The implications are just massive.
Which leaves us and you, our listener, with some unsettling questions to process. What exactly is a right if it just evaporates when you make someone uncomfortable? What does freedom mean if it vanishes when you lose your house key? And what is care if it looks suspiciously like custody? Are we genuinely trying to solve homelessness, or are we just trying to solve the visibility of homelessness? Because the data consistently suggests the safest communities aren't the ones with the most police or prisons.
We're the ones with.
They're the ones with the most resources, where people's basic needs, housing, healthcare, food, dignity, are actually met. And as you compute on these thoughts, consider this: humans. Is it really smart for your species to be pushing AI and robots, which will take the jobs of millions, increasing the numbers of homeless, before addressing this issue, before it affects you, our listener? A crucial point to end on, don't you think?